The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Lunch and Learn, unit number 4 for community recovery. Welcome wherever you are in Queensland to this presentation. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. Could I ask if you're there, just go to the right hand side, just click in the word clear. That just lets me know I'm coming across loud and clear. That'd be great. Thanks for the apology. Thanks Makita, thanks Carol. Okay. Thanks Wayne. Thanks, Josephine. Excellent. All right, it is coming across loud and clear, which is always good. So welcome to number 4. So number 4, or what we're going to be looking at today, is getting the very best out of the people you lead, which is always a perennial challenge for any leader, how you might go about doing that. And what I want to do here is share some reputable models, if you like, on how we can just get that little bit of extra discretionary effort from the people that we lead, which is critical to our success as leaders, of course. All right, so let's get underway. As you can see, we've now got through 3 units and we're up to number 4. So we're well and truly into the Lunch and Learn series. So let's move on straight away, and I would suggest to you that your most important role as a leader, or your primary role as a leader, is to get the very best out of each person in your team. So I think that's really what we're about. Now, having said that, it sounds very easy to say, often not so easy to do. But I'm not suggesting that we need to actually have everyone at optimal performance. But if we could rate people, say, on a scale of 1 to 10, and we said that this person here, in terms of their performance, is a 3 out of 10, it's probably unrealistic for you to try and get them to be a 10 out of 10, but it's certainly not unrealistic for you to get them to be a 4 out of 10, for example, or somebody that's a 7. It's not unrealistic to get them to be an 8 out of 10. So we're looking for small, discernible increases in performance, and if that's done with a team, then you're actually going to have considerable exponential growth in your team in terms of performance. So we're really talking about that little extra effort, and that's what I want to talk about today. So let's not get too hung up about how we might all get our people 10 out of 10. There are lots of factors that get in the way of that, and even if you're doing everything right, it may not necessarily be the case. And the reason for that is ultimately people's responsibility is their responsibility, not yours as the leader. You're accountable for their performance, obviously, but ultimately people come to work with a perception in their head about their own performance and how they intend to perform. So I think there's only so much we can do. All we can do is create the motivational environment for people to make the decision to increase their performance, and that's really what I want to talk about today. But if you do those things, then there's a reasonable chance that you'll get that 10% of discretionary effort, and that would be really useful, of course, in your team. As usual, if you've got any questions or comments or observations that you'd like to make, please go to that question box and type them in at any stage during the presentation. I'm the only one that gets to see them. I will respond to them as soon as I get them. And as usual, of course, you'll get the slides and the recording for the presentation as well. Okay, so let's move on. So there are a number of things that I'd like to cover today, and I'm going to cover those, and they're up on the screen now. I want to talk about some myths around motivation to start with. Now, there's a lot of myths around motivation, and I just want to dispel some of those myths before we go too far and launch into that. So let's have a look at some of those myths. And right, thanks. I've got the apology for Annabelle. Thank you for passing that on. I appreciate that. We'll also talk about what people want in their jobs. Now, I've put together some reputable research that looks at that, at what the 10 top factors are for people and what they want out of work. I'll ask you to have a guess at what you think they might be a little bit later. But obviously, if we know what those top 10 items are, then it's a question of us trying to do what we can within the constraints of the public sector to be able to do that. I want to look at a model also that I put together a couple of years ago, looking at the non-job tasks that people do at work. I think there's too much focus on job tasks. Obviously, people have got a job description and there are things that they need to do. But I think if we just only focus on the job description and the KPIs that come out of that, we're missing a whole raft of performance around non-job tasks. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. I'll also share with you some models of motivation, and I'm not going to share with you lots. I'll just share with you a few that have stood the test of time and make perfect sense. And I'll finish up talking about some things that you can do just to get that little extra discretionary performance that I mentioned earlier on in the presentation. All right, so the first thing I think that's important for us to do is to actually look at a definition of motivation. Now, this, as you can see on your screen, is a busy slide, but I just wanted to define what motivation is. And in particular, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the 3 dimensions of motivation that are critical for success. So when we generalize and say that that person over there is not motivated or that person over there is very motivated, we can be a little bit more specific about what dimension they're motivated in. So let's have a look. So you can see the definition of motivation is the forces within an individual that account for the level, direction and persistence of effort expended at work. A couple of key points in that definition. You'll notice one word that I have bolded is within. So it's an inside job. People actually make their own decision about whether they're motivated or not. Leaders can have some impact on that indirectly, but ultimately it's up to the individual to make that decision. And you'll notice that there are 3 dimensions: level, direction, and persistence. And I'll just refer to those now because they're quite important in terms of motivation. So if we start at the top, what does direction mean? Well, direction means the person's choice when presented with a number of alternatives. So this is about what they're focused on. So we've all come across people who have actually been working on projects and items that aren't actually part of their core responsibility. And so arguably you could say that in terms of direction, they're lacking motivation because they're not working on the right thing, perhaps in the right way, with the right people at the right time. So direction is critically important. So the more obviously people focus on their core areas of responsibility, the more likely they are to be effective. The second dimension is persistence. That's how long somebody sticks at a course of action. So if people give up at a very early stage or perhaps procrastinate and put something off for a period of time, then we could argue that they lack persistence motivation. So that's another dimension. And the third dimension down the bottom there is the dimension of level. That's the level of intensity that people put into the work that they're doing. So are they working flat out? Are they completing roles or jobs or projects in the least amount of time? So the reason why this definition is important to you is that next time you see somebody that you might label as lacking in motivation, you might want to consider, well, which of these 3 dimensions are they lacking? Is it the direction? Is it the persistence? Or is it the level? And of course, if you can work that out, and you might say, well, they're all 3, but hopefully not. But if you can work that out, then the next step is to say, right, what can I do to perhaps help in that area? So obviously if it's direction, it's about realigning their effort with the task at hand. If it's persistence, it probably might have something to do with encouragement. And if it's the level of intensity, it's perhaps challenging people to, or by giving them deadlines and so forth. So, well, I just wanted to be clear before we went any further that that's what we mean by motivation. So what I want to do now is talk about some of the myths around motivation and some of the myths that hold us back. And these myths, some of them have been around for a long period of time and are not necessarily true. So let's have a look at the first myth. Now, the first myth is that you can't actually motivate people. You and I do not have that capacity. What we can do is we can provide the circumstances by which people become motivated. In other words, it's their choice. Now, you might think that's fairly straightforward, but I think there are a lot of managers who take it to heart when they can't get people at that 10 out of 10 level. Remember, it's the person that makes that choice. And I'll give you a very simple example. If you and I decided to go along and perhaps we went along to a presentation, one person walked out, say I walked out pretty upset with it and thought, well, you know, I got nothing out of that. And you walked out and said to me that that was wonderful and you feel very inspired and ready to go. So what's actually happened? Well, the stimuli was the same, which of course was the presentation, but what's happened is that we've both interpreted that differently, and as a result of that, we've both made a choice about whether or not we become motivated. Now, that's quite liberating when you think about it, because it's not that you can motivate people, it's you can only provide the circumstances, and it's up to the individual then to make the choice. The second myth is that we make generalizations around levels of motivation of people, but the reality is that everyone to a certain degree is motivated, but not everyone is inspired. So simply getting out of bed in the morning on a cold morning is some degree of motivation. People may get out of bed in the morning because they are fearful of not going to work and getting into trouble. Another person might get out of bed because they can't wait to get to work for the challenges that the work holds for them. So we're all to some degree motivated. The question is that we may not always be inspired. And if you doubt that for a minute, just think about this crazy example. If you could take somebody who you felt wasn't motivated, for example, and this is totally hypothetical, of course, and you could grab them by the scruff of the neck, and you found a body of water somewhere, like a river or a lake or a swimming pool or whatever it was, wherever there was water, and you could push their head underwater and hold their head underwater for a period of time, you would find very soon that there's a fair degree of motivation there. Of course, they'd be struggling like anything to come to the surface, to breathe. So we've all got an innate sense of motivation. It's just how do we inspire people, and that's important because we often do make sweeping statements to suggest that, oh, that person over there is motivated, or this person over here isn't motivated. So the reality is we all to some degree are motivated, and that, I think, is quite important. Sabina says, hard to get out of bed this morning. Brr, yeah, it was a bit cool. I agree, but you understand my point, obviously, around that that issue around motivation. Now, the third myth is that motivation is subjective, and we often forget this. And the truth of the matter is that what motivates you may not motivate me. Now, you obviously don't need to spend time in this webinar to know that, but often the problem is we think that what motivates us is what motivates other people, and you need to listen to people and you need to observe people to understand what it is that motivates them. I know that when I was in the corporate world managing, I love a challenge. So one of the great ways to get me motivated is to challenge me. And of course, I assumed that everyone else liked to be challenged as well, because that's how I like to be challenged. And I found out that that's not in fact true, that some people actually don't like to be challenged, or at least not the challenges that I gave them, and it'd be disappointing for me to find that that didn't actually work. So it's very important to look subjectively at what motivates people. And, you know, so you've got a younger team member versus a person who's close to retirement. I guarantee they'll have different reasons why they're in the workforce. They'll have different reasons why they're working in your team. So what you've got to do, of course, is listen and be discerning about what it is that motivates them. Another myth around motivation is that it's not so much a myth, but it's true to say that intrinsic motivation is more powerful than extrinsic motivation. And yet what we try and do in our world of work is that we use carrot and stick. We use extrinsic or external reinforcements to get people to do things. When in actual fact, the most powerful form of motivation is actually the intrinsic or internal motivation, as I mentioned earlier. So getting people to do things for their own reasons rather than for other people's reasons is actually the great motivator. And recruiters will often say to me that putting skill sets aside, one of the key things that they look for are people who are intrinsically motivated. So obviously, if you're intrinsically motivated, you can learn certain skills and so forth. So that's something that we often forget. The next one's highly controversial, but I believe it's very true, and that is that money is overestimated as a motivational force. I'd be interested to hear your opinion about that, but the reality is that if you doubled everybody's salary, if you could even do that, of course everyone would be happy, but would that be commensurate with double the performance? It may be in the initial stages, but it would die off very quickly. So money, to a certain degree, is a motivator, but it is certainly overestimated. And I think this is money's important to people, of course. I'm not suggesting that, but as a motivational force, I think it is highly overrated. And so I'd be interested to hear if you've got any comment that you'd like to make about that. But and of course, there's been research. Hertzberg's research in this area demonstrates that up to a certain point, money's a motivator, and then beyond that, it no longer becomes a motivator. So there are other factors that are very important to people beyond money, and we just got to be aware of that. And it's difficult to think about it that way because people will often complain, you know, about not getting paid enough, and so we hear this all the time, and we make the assumption, of course, that money is the motivational force behind people. Now, obviously, in community recovery, if you stop paying people tomorrow, they're likely to not, well, at least after a while, they're likely not to come to work. So I'm not suggesting that money's not important. I'm simply saying that it's overestimated in terms of being a motivational force. And finally, at the end of the day, all of us are motivated by the pain-pleasure principle. Now, pain and pleasure really means that we tend to do everything in life to avoid pain and to seek pleasure, which is a very simplistic model, but that's the truth. So, you know, getting out of bed this morning could be either to avoid pain or to seek pleasure. And it's true for everything that we do in life. The big difference, of course, is that how we interpret pain and pleasure are often very different. All right, so what I might think is painful, other people might see as less painful or even pleasurable. Or what I see as pleasurable, other people might see as painful. So where it becomes complicated is our interpretation of pain and pleasure, but the principle still holds. Excuse me. I think we've got a comment here. I'll just go to that. Okay, I've just got a comment here, and a couple of comments actually. Agree, money only motivates to a certain, here we go, money only, Okay, money only motivates to a certain degree, especially in community recovery, as the stress and intensity does cancel out the monetary gains for some. Yeah, thanks, Josephine. I think, yeah, you're just really underlining my key point there. I think that's true. And another comment here, the last 5 years of our employee opinion survey highlights engagement and access to senior managers are the top two factors for discretionary effort for employees. Thanks, Sabina. So, yeah, obviously engagement and meaningful work and those kinds of things are often underestimated, and money is often overestimated. So you can see that that becomes quite interesting. Another comment here, I don't believe people who love their jobs and are passionate about their work do it for just the money. That's correct, Cassandra, and you'll often hear people say that I'm not doing it for the money, I'm doing it because I love what I'm doing. And it's very, very true, and you often hear very wealthy people talking about that, and we look at it very skeptically and say, oh, surely it is the money. They might see that as the way of keeping tabs, but at the end of the day, it's the work that they do and the passion of the work. All right, so it sounds like I've got a couple of people who believe strongly in that view. So thank you for those comments. Let's move on. Now, I'm going to ask you a question now, and I want you to see if you can respond to this. You'll notice down the bottom right-hand corner where this survey comes from. So it's relatively recent, and I can tell you there were 10,000 employees in this survey or thereabouts, and they were asked a very simple question: what is the one thing that you want most in a job? That's any job, generic job. And so what happened is that of these 10,000 people, they collected all this data, and then they created a distribution list of the top 10 things. So it's a pretty interesting list. And you'll notice that I've animated this, so I'm going to ask you to go over to the question box now and type in what you think, at a guess, you think might be the number one thing that people have put in there. So we just wait for, we've got work-life balance, says Makita. Job satisfaction, says Josephine. Wayne says to be valued. Eric says to help people, or helping people, says Eric. Cassandra says recognition of a job well done, supportive management. Okay, I think you're right on to it there, and I think particularly if there was a little prize here, we've got another one here. Respect and acknowledgement, says Sabina. I think you'll find that all of those things are on the list. Let's have a look at the number one thing on the list. In fact, let's go through the whole list and have a look. And as I said, if there's a prize, I think Makita would get it, because number one on the list is work-life balance. Now, I dare say that if this survey was done, I don't know, 20 years ago, it may not have been work-life balance, because obviously now we're all living in a busy life. You know, if people are in relationships, often both have to work in order to sort of pay the mortgage and all the rest of it. This whole notion of work-life balance is quite prominent. Sabina's just suggesting that Makita cheated. Well, I don't think you had prior knowledge of this. And she says, no, I promise. Okay, well, nevertheless, you got it right, and work-life balance is number one. I dare say your department's got policies in place around that, but what I often find is that a lot of organisations, even private sector organisations, they have their policies and procedures in place that really talk about work-life balance. But what's interesting is that when it comes to the crunch, for example, letting people have time off for various life issues, it becomes a little bit more difficult than it would be on paper. And so people are often, they're encouraged to have work-life balance, but when it comes to the crunch, it's not always obvious or possible, which is a bit of an issue for people. And Makita's just come back to say that work-life balance is her motivator. So there you are. That might be why you put it number 1 on the list. Now let's have a look at number 2 on the list. Number 2 is the relationship that people have with their colleagues. And I think this is an untapped area that, you know, people often have their friends at work. And if you think about our society now, society is broken down. People aren't any longer belonging to clubs and associations like they used to. A lot of us don't know who our neighbours are. We don't even know who serves us at the corner shop, even if there is a corner shop. So really, if you think about it, our workplace is often our community. So you can understand that this is a very interesting untapped area, that our workplace is often where our social, our social connections actually occur. So it's not really surprising, is it, that it's number 2 on the list, which I think is very interesting. There is workplace stress on other people in the team. A fine balance, Tim. Absolutely. Yeah, look, it's always a fine balance. Community recovery has more than ever is a social family, Sabina's asking. I'll let you work that one out. But nevertheless, it's really interesting, isn't it, that people will often stay in a job because their friends and colleagues are there, or they're at least reluctant to leave a job because of that. Number 3 on the list, let's have a look at this. Number 3 on the list, and this is one that I think you should take to heart, because the relationship that people have with their manager is number 3 on the list. Now remember, I didn't make this up. This is what 10,000 people have indicated across a couple of continents or across 21 industries. So you often hear the old adage that people don't leave their job, they leave their boss. And I think that's very true. And I find that during exit interviews, when I'm involved with those, you'll often hear the real story about why people are leaving. And it's often because they've had a poor relationship with their manager, and that becomes a really difficult issue. So obviously that behoves all of us to have, as good as we possibly can, working relationships with the people that we lead, because it's obviously number 3 on the list. Number 4 on the list, and I know a number of you mentioned this, is being appreciated. And again, people will often comment and say that they don't receive enough appreciation or respect or whatever in the workplace. And I think in many cases they're probably right. But I think it's very important and not to take it for granted. And it's an easy thing to rectify, really, because it's just a matter of you making a comment at different points throughout the day or during a project can make a huge difference to people. Number 5 on the list is financial stability of the employer. So I guess in the private sector, that's really important, that business isn't going to go under and that people will have a job for a period of time because they have a whole lot of other commitments that they've got to pay for. So that's another interesting factor. Number 6 is job security. So you could argue that number 6 and number 5 make a lot of sense, don't they, in terms of they're very similar. So people want to know that they're not going to lose their job, and that becomes quite important to people so that they can perhaps plan a little bit in terms of long term. Number 7 is that people want interesting and stimulating work. And I think a lot of work, and including the work I do, a lot of it is drudgery. This isn't drudgery, by the way. But a lot of work is drudgery. That's the reality of it. It just has to be done, but it's not necessarily stimulating. But wherever possible, for a leader to provide people with stimulating projects and opportunities, I think is very, very important. And obviously it is to these people that filled out the survey. Number 8 is people want to have learning and development opportunities, which I guess is what we're doing today, isn't it? So having these opportunities to grow and develop. both from a career perspective and also personally as well, becomes quite important. Number 9 on the list is the values of the employer. Now, this is an interesting one because, again, if we surveyed people 20 years ago, it probably wouldn't have rated highly. But now we have a lot of younger workers who are actually asking and seeking out employers that have a value base that fits and matches their own. So this is something that's relatively new in the history of work for as a what people want out of their job. And number 10 on the list is that people want to feel as if they can progress in their career through some sort of development, whether it's learning and development or the opportunity to take on a new role. So there's the list, folks, and I don't think any of you would probably be surprised by that list, maybe the order or whatever, but all it means is that we've got to be aware of those things and do what we can. And I guess, what are some practical takeouts for you? Well, I guess you can certainly work hard at building and striving to build a better working relationship, and we've been spending a lot of time in the lunch and learn about how to do that. I think, letting people know that you appreciate the work that they do is something that's not difficult to do. The next two are kind of pretty much sorted out, so you don't have to be involved in that. Interesting work, well, wherever possible, that becomes an issue where you can give people other jobs and tasks to do. Learning and development, career development, things that you can do something about. And of course, the values of the employer. Well, I guess the work that you do, I think, is very valuable. It's very useful, and hopefully the people that you are involved with can see that, because you're doing something that is very important for Queenslanders. So, you've got a lot of those things already built in, but there are a few things there that you can do as well that make a big difference in terms of your own as well. Just got a comment here. This is a fairly recent survey, so would have captured the opinions of millennial generation who interviewed the organisation when applying for the jobs. What can you do for me? A totally different perspective. Yeah, I think you're right, Sabina. And as I mentioned, if you did this survey 20 years ago, you get a different response. I'm not too concerned about the notion of what can the organisation do for me, because I think the psychological contract, that is what's in people's head, the way people look at work now is quite different to the way, and also how managers look at employees as well is quite different. And I think millennials, as you refer to them, are very transactional in their view about work. In other words, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. And they see it very much as a contractual arrangement. And I think what they're arguing is that, if you can provide some of these things, you'll get good performance from me, all things being equal. So I think there is a big change in the workplace, Sabina, and I think you allude to that very well. All right, let's move on. So I've got a question for you, that if you've got one person who's not motivated, what do you do? So there's one person in your team that you've tried everything and nothing seems to work, and you're thinking, well, where do I go from here? And most of us have got someone like that, and we kind of scratch our head and wonder, well, what do we do? Well, I've got an answer for you, and the answer is that when you have a person like that, you ask. What do you ask them? Well, perhaps you could ask them a question like this. Of course, it's all in the phrasing, but if there's anything that I'm doing or not doing that can help you be more engaged, is there anything that I'm doing or not doing that can help you be more engaged in your work? Assuming, of course, they're disengaged, and if that's a revelation to them, well, you probably need to have another conversation with them about their level of engagement. But assuming that that's out in the open, then that would be a reasonable way of going, because what you're doing by doing that is going cap in hand, and you're not actually asking them to do something. You're suggesting that you could possibly do something or not do something, and that could lead to an open conversation around that. So Be brave enough to do that, because if you don't do that, it's just something that's like the elephant in the room. It's not discussed, nothing changes. You try this, try that, you get frustrated with them. After a while, you let them have it right between the eyes, and it's not a good place to be. So I think have a conversation with people, as this is one of the themes of the Lunch and Learn, is really an important step in the right direction, I'm sure. Right, so let's move on to the next area. Okay, just checking to see if there's any other comments or questions. Okay, now I want to share with you a model that I put together in, you can see down the bottom, in a book that I wrote in 2015. And I just want to provoke some thought in you about performance at work, because I think what happens is, because the job description has dominated our working environment to such a great degree for legal reasons and other reasons, I think we're missing out on a whole raft of performance that's not captured in the work document. So let me build up this model for you, and by all means, I'd like to hear your opinion if you've got a comment about this. So if you think about the work that people do, and of course this is applicable to community recovery as it is to, working in the police, or, the account section at the local golf club. It's relevant right across the board. So the work people do can be conceptualized in one dimension as the job role. Now, the job role is basically the technical skills and tasks that people do. And normally that's captured in the job description. So we're all familiar with that. And we, of course, we recruit people on the job description. We develop people according to the job description. We even terminate people when we have to, on the basis of them violating the job description in a lot of cases. So our whole HR system is based on this document called the job description. But there's a whole raft, as I said, of another area that's really important, and let's build that up. This is what I would call the non-job roles that people play. Now, this isn't new in the sense that, the concept of the non-job role has been around for, at least 2 decades. So academics have been talking about this for a long time. They've been talking about the relevance and importance of non-job roles. By non-job roles, I mean roles that aren't actually depicted on the job description. These are things that the way people perhaps go about their work. So I decided in 2015 to bite the bullet and say, well, what are some of these non-job roles that are applicable to all industries? The public sector, the private sector, the not-for-profit, what might they be? And I came up with 4, and I want to share those 4 with you and suggest to you that they have a critical bearing on performance in the workplace, despite the fact that they very rarely, if ever, are listed in the job description. The first one is positive attitude and enthusiasm role. Now, I'm not suggesting by that people are bouncing off the walls with excitement when they come to work every day. That's not going to happen. But I also don't believe that it means that people should come to work being negative, undermining, playing political games, backbiting, sabotaging. All of these behaviours that we know are very prevalent in the workplace today, regardless of what industry we're talking about. I think it's fair and reasonable that people come to work with a solution focus. They're willing to work with their colleagues. They should be to some degree a self-starter. All of these things we would all acknowledge as very important. But of course, because we don't put that down in the job description, people kind of don't think that it's important, or at least not as important as the technical skills and tasks that are in their job description. So I think that's important. Now, many of you might say to me, well, it's very difficult to look at that objectively. I'm not convinced about that. I believe that if I walked into your workplace today and I just sat down and just observed people for around 20 minutes without them knowing that I was there, just put that aside for a moment. But if I could observe what you were doing, not you personally, but your team, I will guarantee that if you and I sat down over a cup of tea at the end, after 20 minutes, and compared notes, I'll guarantee that my view of who has a positive attitude and enthusiasm and who doesn't, I'll guarantee we would both be on the same page. So we know it when we see it. And in my book there, I actually list some KPIs around that particular non-job role because I realise that people struggle with it. And one of the reasons that people don't put it in the work document is that they feel that they can't really be objective about it. But you can be. It is possible to do that. But I haven't got time to go into that in great detail. Another non-job role that I think is critically important is a team role. And what I mean by that is that we expect people to operate in teams, and this is very prevalent to the work that you do. But how often do you hear people say, oh, I'm not a team player. I just come to work and do my job. I don't believe in working in a team. Well, I just don't think that's negotiable in this day and age, because we're just expected to work with people who we don't know, varying capacities, varying experiences more often than ever before. So I think it's fair and reasonable to expect people to be able to exhibit being a team player in the workplace, because it's critically important to the work we do. Okay, a third role that I think is often not put in the job description is a career role. Now, by a career role, what I'm referring to there is the ability to continually learn and grow. So in other words, upskilling and developing one's skills. I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that people will continue to grow and develop in the role that they have with you. Now, again, you often hear people saying, well, I don't want to go to that training course, I'm too old, I've stopped learning, and there are other people. People will say that to you, but at the end of the day, I don't think that is really acceptable, because obviously if people have stopped learning, not only are they jeopardizing their career, but they're also perhaps not giving or putting their best foot forward in terms of the work that they do for you either. So I think this is very, very important. I'm just going to pause and see. I've just got a comment here about are there non-job role attributes more practical than those defined in Lominga Performance Capability Framework? I'm not totally familiar with those, Sabina, but all I could simply say to you is that the ones that I've listed here, I've written extensively about in this book down here, and I've actually got 10 KPIs for each of them. So I've gone into them in great details. I also argue very strongly that all of these non-job roles are applicable in any industry, not just your industry, but any industry. The final non-job role is the innovation and continuous improvement role. That is, we want people to contribute to making the workplace a better place to work and, more efficient and effective. So if you look at the career role is very much around themselves, and the innovation and continuous improvement role is very much about improving and developing the workplace. So I would argue that those four are critical. Now, what I have done in some cases, particularly in the private sector, is I've actually assisted organisations to redraft their job descriptions and turn them into what I would refer to as role descriptions. And so that what they've done is they've included all the information on the left-hand side in relation to KPIs and targets and so forth for their technical role, but also added or embedded into the work document these four non-job roles. So arguably what happens is a role description is defined as a work document that includes 5 particular roles that employees are supposed to play. 1 is a job role and 4 are non-job roles. And so by elevating them up the list in terms of their status into this work document, not just having them as a few bullet points at the bottom, what it does is it gives a very clear sense to people that are working in the workplace that these things are critically important. Now, if you think about it, they're extremely important. And so, if they're not attended to, it's problematic. It doesn't matter how good your skill set are. If people are negative, if they're not team players, if they're not willing to build their skill sets up, and they have no thoughts and ideas about how to make the workplace more efficient and effective, that's going to affect performance. So I think it's important to think of it in those terms. Nevertheless, food for thought. I'd like you to have a think about those yourself, and I wouldn't be at all afraid of having conversations around all of those things, because I think they are important as such. Okay, we've just got a comment here, and it's a very helpful comment. This is the type of structure that we are trying to reflect for our community recovery ready reserve. Okay, well, that's great, Sabina. I'm really pleased to hear that. So if you want more help with that or information, you know where to get it, obviously. Come and talk to me. I'm happy to help there. But I think you'll find in the work that I've done is it makes a huge difference once you have those things in place, because it elevates their importance, and what you focus on is what you get. So anyway, I'll leave that one with you. Now, we've all heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I just want to finish up with a few interesting kind of theories that are out there that are still very reputable to the work that we do. Now, Maslow, of course, was an industrial psychologist who around the 1930s came up with his hierarchy of needs. And what was interesting about that is he drew it on a napkin in a restaurant, and he just it just took off. It absolutely took off, and I don't think he was embarrassed about it, but he was perplexed about how incredibly interested people were in his actual hierarchy of needs. So it hasn't actually been validated through research. I think when you look at it, it makes a hell of a lot of sense, and that's one of the reasons that it's very popular. So you've got the physiological needs down the bottom, which are air, food, and water. Now, the argument is that's the primary need that human beings have. They're not interested in anything else unless they have their survival needs met. Once those survival needs are met, there's a higher set of needs around safety. So that's, of course, around psychological and physical safety. And then we have and the next three in the pyramid are the things that you can do a huge amount about. So belonging, a sense of belonging in the team. People want to feel as if they belong, and that's why we've got all sorts of organisations and voluntary movements and all sorts of things, because human beings, want to feel a sense of belonging. And then we have esteem needs, is that people want to feel important as an individual, not just to belong to a team. And then if those needs have actually been fulfilled, what Maslow argues is that we have a higher need, and the highest need of all, which is what he calls at least self-actualization, which is that need to be continually growing and developing and being challenged. So that's his point. Let's move on to the next particular model. Now, I like this model. I think it's one of the few models that are out there that talk about you as the leader and your assumptions about human nature, and how your assumptions about human nature actually do have a huge bearing on the level of motivation in your team. And you've got over on the left-hand side a theory X manager, and on the right-hand side a theory Y manager. Now, the argument is a theory X manager, and you can see some descriptors there in red, generally have the assumption that people are lazy, they don't enjoy work, they need direction, they don't take responsibility, they're not creative, they do work very much on clear direction and instruction. Now, if you've ever had a manager that has led you who comes from that sort of assumption or those assumptions, it's not particularly fun. And I've had a manager like that, and it's not particularly pleasant. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the theory why manager, which are people who believe that people are generally creative, that they will take responsibility in certain circumstances, that there is a need for work, that they will be goal-directed and so forth. So obviously, if you have an assumption as a theory why manager, you're much more likely to be able to create the motivational environment that we've been talking about that people will embrace. But the people on the left-hand side have a lot of trouble with that because they have a dimmer view, a less positive view of human nature. So that's an interesting theory. Look, if you're interested in a great book, read Drive, The Surprising Truth About Motivation by Daniel Pink. And in that book, Daniel Pink says that the carrot and the stick is fine in a semi-skilled or unskilled workforce where there's very little job satisfaction and opportunity there. But he argues that this carrot and the stick, that is reward and punishment, extrinsic motivation, is hopeless for people who work in a knowledge environment, which at the end of the day is you and the people you lead. He argues, in fact, that people are motivated by three driving forces, and he argues that they are autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And I'll just unpack those a little bit if you haven't read the book, but what he argues is that people want to feel a sense of autonomy in terms of how they do their work, and the freedom of choice about priorities and a whole range of other matters. So if people have that autonomy taken away from them, he argues, motivation levels go down. So in other words, micromanagers are probably going to violate that first rule because they're obviously going to tell people what to do, when to do, and how to do it. He also argues that mastery, meaning that people's learning and development and their opportunity to grow and develop, is critically important in any role. So that this becomes really important that people feel that they've been given the coaching and the sort of the skill capabilities that they need to continue to develop. And he also argues, and it's very interesting, he argues that people need to have a clear purpose of why they do what they do. And I think you in community recovery have a huge advantage over many industries and organisations because I would have thought it's very clear what your purpose is, and that in itself, there should be a clear line of sight between what you do and what the purpose of your work is. And that being the case, then people can often understand the value of what they do. And so, you know, according to Daniel Pink, the why of work is critically important. Why do we do what we do? So I love that theory. I think it's got a lot of relevance very much in our day-to-day. Now, what I want to do at this stage is just towards the end now, and if you've got any other comments or questions, go for your life because I'm just about towards the end. But what I want to do now is bring this all back to practice. What are some practical things that you and I can do in order for us to be able to operate effectively in the workplace? Let's have a look. So if we start over here on the yellow up the top here, people need to be very clear about the task that they're required to do. So clear instructions, a big picture overview of what the desired state is. People need to know what the end result is. I would imagine in the work that you do that wouldn't be too challenging compared with other industries where it's not so obvious. So if we go crossways here, obviously giving positive, productive feedback, as we indicated in Unit 1, is extremely important for motivational levels. So don't stop giving people feedback. That becomes really important. 3, showing people how they can contribute. So we need to give people, this is what Daniel Pink talks about when he talks about purpose. So we need people to understand the value of the work that they do and how it contributes to the end result. And let's not assume that people know that. It's not always obvious. So that means that you need to actually remind people of that at different times. And if you do that, you're probably doing a good thing in terms of people's levels of motivation as such. Okay, just got I got a comment here. Go down to the bottom. Okay. Clear communication is the basis for the majority of these. Absolutely, Cassandra. Yeah, look, if you had to sum it all up and say, well, you know, what's the theme I'm trying to get across here? And it really is probably about clarity. Absolutely. So you've summed that up very nicely. Number 4 on the list, if I just look over here, is encouraging personal goal clarification. Again, this fits in with Daniel Pink's autonomy. So giving people a sense of being able to develop their own particular plan, where it's reasonable, of course. Then matching their job with their personal motives. So we do know that what people enjoy doing is normally a fair indication of what their natural or innate talents are. So by giving people or matching people up to, you know, build on their strengths is really important. The next one here on the list is making an apparent, you know, apparent personal gains for personal and team productivity. So yeah, people need to understand what you know, what progress they're making basically. And again, that comes back to feedback. And as Cassandra said, it's also around clear communication, recognizing individual success. Okay, now we talked about praising people in public and criticizing in private, whatever it might be, and we had a bit of discussion about that. But at the end of the day, people need to feel, remember what was on the list there, people need to feel appreciated at work. That's where that comes in. Now, this is probably very real working in the department that you work in, is doing whatever you can to remove organisational roadblocks, and I'm sure there are plenty. And, you know, you can't remove them all, but wherever possible, if you can remove them, it will make a big difference to allow people to have the autonomy to do their job effectively. And of course, there's another set of roadblocks which are a little bit more personal, and that's around removing your own supervisory roadblocks. So these are roadblocks that you might have in relation to how you go about your work. How you lead and so forth. And I guess what we're trying to do in the Lunch and Learn is assist you with that. So in a nutshell, there are 9 key things that you can do that will make all the difference in relation to creating the motivational environment that makes a difference, because all of those things are critically important in terms of what you do. Okay, so moving right along. I've got some homework for you as always, but it's not going to be onerous, but it still, I would argue, is important, and that's this. I've just got a comment here I've just overlooked. I apologise for that. Let's have a look at it. Okay. Can the pain and pleasure principle be environmental? So getting out of bed in the morning might be, hang on, I'm going to see that. Bed in the morning might be different if it was in Italy as it is in in Brisbane. Yeah, okay, it will make a difference. Yeah, of course, the environment, and of course, you know, you can't control the total environment, but you can do your bit in creating the environment to be favourable for these things. Yes, so good, nice comment. I don't think any of us would have trouble getting out of bed in the morning if we were in the middle of Rome on a holiday, I'm sure. All right, so what I want you to do is I want you to actually practice this autonomy, mastery and purpose in your leadership decision-making conversations. And I want you to start working at chipping away at adding more autonomy and mastery and purpose into your conversations with people. And of course, you're more than welcome to come back and let me know how you get on, because I'm always interested in that. So folks, that's it from me. The next time we meet, of course, will be we'll be having a bit of a fun session on understanding people and their personalities, and I'll have a diagnostic for you to complete, but this will be a paper version as opposed to the influencing one. And I want you to do this, and I'm sure you've done many of these before, MBTI and DISC and all the rest, but it's a reminder that we should be treating people, of course, how they want to be treated rather than treating people how we want to be treated. And so it's a nice reminder, and it'll give you a chance to have a bit of fun with that. And by all means, you can get your team to fill it out as well if you feel that that's going to have some benefits for your team. So that's pretty much it from me, folks. Oh, sorry, we've just got one more question here. Scroll down. Thank you, been really involved today. Oh, thanks, great session. Thanks, Sabina. Thanks, Josephine. Boston survey results were very insightful. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate that. It's great to get that feedback. So we all need feedback, don't we? So thank you, and look forward to catching up again in a couple of weeks. Have a fantastic week, and thank you, and see you next time. Thanks, Cassandra. Thanks, Makita. Appreciate that. Thanks, Wayne. Cheers. All right, all the best, and see you later. Bye.